They said she had no right to touch the record. The war archive of Cale Vorn, Alpha King of the Drevas territories, had not been corrected in 11 years. It had been copied, illuminated, distributed to 5 border keeps, and the great library at Helvast, and recited at every solstice assembly since the wars ended. Every victory was listed. Every line of the king's name was carved in stone above the eastern gate. The record was complete. The record was sacred. And 3 of the victories in it were hers. Stay with this, if you will, because what happened inside the archive hall in the winter of the Frost King's reckoning is a story most scribes decided not to write down. The ones who were present chose to forget it. The ones who heard it secondhand called it impossible. The record was changed nonetheless. The woman who changed it is the reason the Drevest pack still stands. Her name was Celine. She had no rank. She had no wolf. She had spent 6 years as the archive's keeper, copying documents by candlelight, cataloging field reports, maintaining the territorial maps that the council consulted and then handed back without thanking her. She was the daughter of a dead border guard and a mother who had died of cold fever the winter Celine turned 14, and she had earned her place in the archive not by birth or bond, but by being, in the quiet opinion of the old archivist Marit, the most precise mind in the keep. Marit had been dead 3 years. Celine had been running the archive alone since, on a stipend that was less than what the stable hands earned and a cot she shared with the cold. She had known for 6 years that the record was wrong. She had found the error in her first month, before she understood the weight of what she was reading. The 3 engagements marked as the King's Field victories, the ravine ambush at Torvik Pass, the river crossing at Dune, the siege breaking at the Ash Walls, had each been planned and executed by a different hand. She had the original field reports. She had the courier logs. She had the maps drawn in margins by someone who understood terrain with a cartographer's precision, and she had the hand that drew them, which was the same hand that had signed the keeper's mark on 4 separate reports from those engagements. The mark was not the king's. It was not any general's mark on record. It was a mark she eventually traced, through 7 years of archived correspondence, to a field scout named Veth Dari, who had died at the Ash Walls on the final day of the siege, and whose body had been recovered with a map still in her boot. Veth Dari, dead at 23, buried in the common ground outside Pelford with no marker, and 3 of the king's victories written in stone. Selin had not reported the error immediately. She was 21 years old and had no wolf, and held a position that could be stripped by a word from any council member with a grievance. She had known that a woman with no rank who walked into the assembly hall and told the Alpha King his war record was wrong would not be listened to. She had known this the way a person knows a locked door, not by trying it, but by understanding what kind of place it was built in. So she had done what she knew how to do. She built the case. 6 years of it. She compiled every source, cross-referenced every date, mapped every messenger route between the field positions and the Capitol archive. She produced a binder of original documents, authenticated by seal and countersigned in her own hand, that laid out in 14 pages of precise notation exactly where the record had been altered, when, and what the original field reports said. It was the kind of document that could not be dismissed on grounds of error. It could only be dismissed on grounds of power. She had known that too. The year the record was finally corrected, the Alpha King came to the archive himself. This was not something kings did. The archive was a working room, not a court chamber, and Cale Vorn had not been in it since the war's end, when he had spent 3 days reviewing the casualty counts personally. That visit was part of the record. Everything else the keep remembered about him was hearsay and weight, A man who had held the Drevast line for 7 years, who had lost 2 betas and a full war council to treachery, who emerged from the wars with a long scar along the jaw and eyes, the servants described as the grey of winter stone. He had not raised his voice in 11 years of rule because he had never needed to, and he had not taken a mate in that time, which the council had been pressing since the 3rd year. He came to the archive in the morning, without escort. Seelan heard the door and did not look up from the document she was copying. "Keeper," he said. She looked up then. The word had landed with a weight she had not expected. Not contempt, not command, just the plain address of a man who had spent 11 years using titles precisely. She recognized him from the assembly hall, where she had delivered quarterly reports to the council while he sat at the head of the table and said nothing. "My lord," she said, and did not rise, because she had learned 3 years ago that rising for council members who addressed her while she was working meant spending the rest of the morning on her feet while they browsed. The king was not a council member. She rose. He was looking at the wall of shelving behind her. The binder was on her desk, as it always was, within reach. "I received a notice," he said, "that a keeper's correction request had been filed against the war record." "Yes," she said. "6 weeks ago. The correction request has been in the council queue for that duration. The council forwarded it to me." She waited. He was still looking at the shelving. In the gray morning light from the high windows, the scar along his jaw was more visible than it had been at distance. He was reading the spines of the bound reports, she realized. Not the decorative copies. The originals. "Torvik Pass," he said. "Dun. The ash walls." "Yes," she said again. He turned. The look he gave her was not the look she had expected, which had been some version of the council's standard expression, a patient skepticism, a readiness to explain why she was wrong. It was something else, something that had weight in it she could not name. "Show me," he said. Seelan opened the binder. She walked him through the field reports, the courier logs, the marginal maps, Veth Derry's keeper's mark, the provenance, the date discrepancies between the official record and the original dispatches. She spoke for 40 minutes. She did not editorialize. She stated what the document said and let him read. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "The record was compiled by my second archivist," he said. "Drevast, the elder. He has been dead 4 years." "I know," she said. "I have his original compilation notes. They are in the binder's appendix. The field reports were in his possession for 3 weeks before they entered the archive, during which time the language of the official summaries was revised." He looked at the appendix. She watched him read. He was slower with documents than she was, she noticed, a field man's reading, thorough and methodical, not the rapid scanning she had trained herself to over years of high-volume copying. His hands were very still on the pages. "Why did you wait 6 years?" he said. It was the question she had prepared for. "Because I needed the case to be unanswerable," she said. "A correction request filed without complete documentation could be dismissed. This one cannot." He looked up from the pages. The gray eyes were level and still, and she found she could not quite read what was moving behind them. "You have done this for a woman who has been dead 6 years," he said. 7, she said. "She died in the last engagement, the 23rd of Ashfall, year 11 of the Drevast Compact." He set the binder down on her desk very carefully. "Who else has seen this?" he said. "No one. The correction request was sealed to the council queue. I have the only copy of the documentation." "You handed this to the council," he said. "I filed it through the correct channel," she said. "Which is the council queue?" Something moved across his face, not the stone she expected, not the dismissal she had steeled herself for. Something that looked, from where she stood, like the expression of a man receiving information about a person he should have known and did not, and understanding, all at once, the shape of what that cost. "The council will not act on this," he said. It was not a question. "I know," she said. "They declined to schedule it for hearing on the grounds that the record has been in use for 11 years, and a retroactive correction presents administrative inconvenience. If you have ever watched a powerful man make a decision he cannot unmake, you will recognize what happened in that archive in the next silence. It did not look like a declaration. It looked like stillness." His hands had not moved from where they rested on her desk. The air in the room had not changed. She would tell no one afterward that the stillness felt like a threshold. He reached for the binder and held it, and then he said, "I will require your presence at the full assembly. The correction will be entered into the record publicly." Seelin had planned for a number of outcomes. She had not planned for that one. "The assembly is convened in 3 days," she said. "Yes," he said. "The council will not—" "The council," he said, "advises me. They do not govern the war record. That is mine." She looked at him. He was looking back at her. There was nothing in his expression she could use to predict what would happen next, and she had learned over 6 years that expressions were a document type she could read fairly well. She picked up her pen. "I will prepare a formal correction statement," she said. "The council found out by the second day. The elder of the War Council, a man named Rovin Ast, arrived at the archive the morning before the assembly with 3 members behind him and an expression calibrated to convey severity without tipping into a threat he could not sustain if questioned. He told Celine that the correction request had been reviewed and found to be based on documents of unclear provenance. He told her that the archivist's mark in question was a common enough formation and could not be definitively attributed. He told her that the king had a great many demands on his attention, and that a keeper who had misfiled the boundaries she was authorized to occupy would find her stipend and her position reviewed. Seelin listened to all of this without speaking. When he finished, she said, "The documents are originals with verified seal impressions. The provenance is documented in the appendix. The attribution is not based on the mark alone, but on a cross-referencing of courier logs, dispatch dates, and field position records that are internally consistent and externally corroborated. I am happy to walk you through the methodology." Rovinast stared at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had expected a different door to open. "The king has been misinformed," he said, "about the reliability of your materials." "The king read the materials himself," she said. He left. She spent the rest of the day copying the correction statement in triplicate and locking 2 copies in the sealed chest at the back of the archive, because a person who has spent 6 years building a case against institutional inertia knows enough to keep copies. That evening, someone broke the lock on the archive door. She heard it from her cot. Not the crack of force, but the quieter sound of a picked lock, patient and deliberate. She did not move from the cot for a count of 30, listening to the sounds of someone searching through the document shelving in the dark. Then she rose and walked to the door and said, clearly, "The original binder is not in the archive." The searching stopped. "The correction statement is also not in the archive," she said. "The only copies in this room are the quarterly reports and the boundary maps, which are available during standard hours." There was a pause. Then the sound of someone leaving through the rear access. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the disturbed shelving, at the binder-shaped gap where the decoy she had left, a similar binder of outdated territorial records, had been removed. She noted it. She went back to her cot and did not sleep much, because she was thinking about whether she had made the copies adequately and whether the locked chest was adequate, and decided after a time that the locked chest was not adequate, and spent the rest of the night moving the documents to a better location, which was inside the lining of her second cloak, folded flat, which she then wore to the assembly the next morning. She had not told anyone she would be at the assembly. She had not been given a seat. She stood at the edge of the floor, near the pillar, as the king took his position at the head of the chamber, and the council arranged itself on the tiered benches, and the assembled pack came in from the keep's hall, and she waited. The correction was the third item on the assembly agenda. The elder Rovan Ast announced it, which was unexpected, and announced it as follows. The keeper of the archive had filed a correction request based on documents of disputed provenance, which the council had reviewed and found insufficient for inclusion in the formal record. Seelan did not move. Cale Vorn looked at the council for a moment. He looked at Rovan Ast specifically, and the look he gave him was the kind of look that did not raise voices because it had never needed to. Then he said, "The documents are not in dispute." The hall went very quiet. "I reviewed them personally," he said. "The provenance is complete. The methodology is sound. The error in the record is documented, and the source of the error is documented." He paused. 3 engagements marked as field victories of this king were planned and executed by a field scout named Veth Dari, who died at the Ash Walls on the 23rd of Ashval, year 11, and was buried without a marker in the common ground outside Pelford. Another silence. It was the kind of silence that belongs to large rooms when something true is being said, that everyone present had been organized around not saying. "The record will be corrected," he said. "Her name will be entered. She will receive a permanent marker in the field of honor. This is not subject to council review." Rovan Ast said, from the tiered bench, "My lord, this sets a precedent." "It does," the king said. "It sets the precedent that the war record of the Drevast territories reflects what happened." He looked across the floor then. Not at the council. Across the floor to where Seelan was standing beside the pillar, her cloak folded over her arm and the documents inside it and 6 years of patient, precise work carried in the flat, quiet expression she had learned to keep on her face in rooms that had not yet decided whether she was allowed to be in them. She had not expected him to look. She did not quite know, when he did, what to do with her face. "The correction request was filed by the archive keeper," he said to the room, "and the correction stands as filed. The record will reflect her authorship of the documentation." He did not look away from her when he said it. The hall was still watching him, and then it watched him step down from the dais, 1 step, then 2, and cross the floor toward the pillar. She had time to think, in the 3 seconds it took him to cross the floor, that she had not prepared for this either. He stopped in front of her. He was taller at this distance than he was from the council table, and the scar along his jaw was very clear. He held out his hand, palm up. She looked at it. "The documents," he said. "I will enter them into the record personally." She unfolded the cloak and took out the correction statement and the original binder, flat and slightly warm from being carried inside the lining. She placed them in his hand. His fingers closed around them. The hall was watching. Every bench, every assembly member, the full council, including Rovan Ast, who had the expression of a man who understood for the first time that a situation had moved past the point where he could revise it. The king did not move back to the dais. He stood in front of her, holding her documents, and he said quietly, to her alone, "You should have had a seat at this assembly." "I did not have a position that entitled me to one," she said. He said nothing for a moment. The hall was still watching. He said, still quiet, still looking at her, "You do now." It was not the breaking point line. The breaking point line came later in the archive, when the assembly had dispersed and the council had been called to a separate meeting she was not invited to, but could imagine clearly, when he returned the binder and stood in the doorway of the room where she had spent 6 years, and said, without ceremony, without preamble, "Stay." And then, because she was the kind of person who needed exactness, he added, "I am asking." The correction took 3 days to formalize. Seelan drafted the language. The king approved it without changes. The council signed it under duress, which was visible in the signatures. Rovenast was removed from the War Council chair the following month by a process of reassignment that was thorough and quiet. Seelan noticed. She did not say anything about it. The marker for Veth Dari was placed in the field of honor in the spring. A simple stone, correctly lettered. Seelan was present when it was placed. So was the king, which was not customary for honor markers, but which was the kind of thing that happens when a man is demonstrating, without making a speech about it, that he understands the shape of what was owed. He did not make speeches. She had noticed that. He was a man who dealt in the same currency she did, the precise, the documented, the thing that could be verified. He brought her the field reports from the border campaigns she had not seen, not because she asked for them, but because he had understood, somewhere in the weeks following the assembly, that the archive she kept was more alive than the war record had been, and that the person keeping it was doing so with a completeness that the Drevas territories had not previously demanded. He asked her questions, she answered them, and sometimes she asked questions back, and the look he gave her when she did was the look of a man unaccustomed to that and not displeased by it. The council did not stop watching. The elder Rovan asked, reassigned but not gone, made a formal inquiry in the 4th month into the appropriateness of the keeper's access to restricted records. The king replied in writing, in language that was extremely clear, and took 4 sentences. Seelan kept a copy. She had started keeping a copy of everything again. Old habit. The binder that had cost her 6 years of silence was now an official document of the archive, sealed and catalogued. The war record had been corrected and redistributed to all 5 border keeps and the great library at Helvast. A name that had been absent from 11 years of formal history was now present in every copy, in every hall. There was a morning in the late winter, after the council inquiry had been replied to, and the marker had been set, and the corrected record had been delivered, when the king came to the archive before the household was fully awake, and she was already there because she was always there before the household was awake, and he sat down across from her desk without being invited and watched her work for a time, without speaking. It was the kind of thing that required some adjustment of expectation on her part. She adjusted it. After a while, he said, "The record for the Southern campaigns needs a keeper. Someone who reads the originals." "The Southern campaigns have been archived," she said, without looking up. "The archive has errors," he said. She looked up then. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her across the floor of the assembly hall, across the distance between the dais and the pillar, before he had crossed it. The gray eyes were steady. It was the look of a man who dealt in exact things. "I cannot do 2 archives," she said. "Not well." "I know," he said. "I am asking what it would take to do it well." She thought about this with the same precision she brought to everything. 2 additional keepers, trained from the correspondence pool. Full access to the original field dispatches, not the compiled summaries. A correction protocol that does not route through the council queue. "Done," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. The archive was very quiet in the morning light. "The wolf I don't have," she said, because she had learned that it was better to name the thing directly. "The rank, the standing in the hierarchy, the council will continue to find it a convenient instrument." "Yes," he said. He did not look away. "They will find it less convenient when it is no longer the instrument they think it is." She did not ask him what he meant by that. She was good at reading documents, and what he was offering to give her was the kind of thing that did not fit on a page, and she was not entirely sure she had prepared for it, and she was also not sure that this was a problem. She picked up her pen. She finished the notation. The ink was even and unhurried. When she set it down and looked at him again, he was still there, patient as stone. She had kept the war record for 6 years in a room the council passed through without looking at her. She had built the case in silence because silence was what was available to her, and she had built it until it was unanswerable, and she had been right to. She was not in the habit of repeating methods that still worked. She slid the binder across the desk to him. The Southern Campaigns, first volume, which she had already pulled 2 weeks ago because she had already started, as she always did, before announcing the intention. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. The expression on his face was one she did not have a cataloging term for yet, but she had started, in the past weeks, to think that she had time to develop one. "The third engagement," she said, "at the Grey Ford crossing. The field report is inconsistent with the battle map. I think the attribution is wrong." He opened the binder. She leaned forward and pointed to the line. The archive was warm. Outside the high window, the frost was still on the ground and would be for another month. And the world beyond it was the same hierarchy it had always been, with the same locked doors and the same council benches and the same long habit of recording what was convenient rather than what was true. Inside the room, two people were reading the same document, and the record was about to be corrected again. She found the second inconsistency before the end of that morning. By noon, she had found 3. The Grey Ford crossing had been listed as a strategic withdrawal under the command of General Perrin Holt, a man who had died the following year of a lung sickness and who had, in life, been known for methodical caution and a preference for defensible positions. The battle map told a different story. The Grey Ford crossing had not been a withdrawal. The positioning marked on the map, units placed at the river bend, a flanking element through the marshland to the east, a drawn-out feint at the fort itself, was not a withdrawal. It was a trap. It had been sprung at dawn, precisely, using the morning fog as cover, and it had caught the enemy column in a crossfire that the withdrawal narrative could not account for. Someone had planned that. Someone with a different way of reading terrain than Perrin Holt had ever demonstrated in any of the field reports she had copied, and she had copied all of them. "The architect of the Grey Ford trap," she said, without looking up from the map, "is not in the record." Cale Vaughan was reading the adjacent dispatch. He had not moved from the chair across her desk in 2 hours. She had noted this peripheral fact and declined to do anything about it. "No," he said. "You know who it was." A pause. Not evasion. More the pause of a man deciding how to say something exactly. "A scout captain," he said. "Served the first 3 years. She left the field when the second campaign ended." "Left," Seelan said. The word had a texture she could feel through the document she was holding. "Dismissed," he said. The General's Corps at the time had a set of opinions about the appropriate role of scout captains in strategic planning. She had formed a competing opinion. Seelan looked up from the map. He was reading the dispatch and not looking at her, and she watched the side of his face for a moment with the same precision she brought to seals and provenance marks. "Do you know her current location?" she said. "I made inquiries," he said. "Last autumn. She is living in Aleph, running a courier operation." "She could be found," Seelan said. "She could," he said. "A formal record of her strategy at Grey Ford, with documentation, and entered into the archive. She is alive, which Veth Dari was not. The acknowledgement could be delivered directly." He set the dispatch down. He looked at her then, across the desk, with an expression that was the same one she had still not catalogued. Patient, exact, carrying something she had not finished measuring. "That would require someone to make the inquiry officially," he said. "Yes," she said, "and to travel to Aleph." "In the spring," she said, "when the roads open. The documentation can be completed here over the winter and authenticated before the journey." He was quiet for a moment. "You intend to go yourself," he said. "The inquiry needs a keeper," she said. "A formal acknowledgement needs to be witnessed and signed. The documentation needs someone who can authenticate originals on site. It also needs," he said, "someone the council cannot send ahead of, to complicate the arrival. She had not said that. He had said it, which meant he had been thinking the same sequence of considerations she had been thinking, and had arrived at the same conclusion. She noted this. It was a kind of document, too, a person who reads the same problem the same way, and she had not known, until recently, what to do with documents like that. The council will send someone to Aelith, she said, as soon as they understand where the inquiry is going. Yes, he said. A keeper traveling with escort cannot be stopped, she said. Not without a formal order from the assembly. No, he said. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. She had seen this before in the past weeks. Not a smile, not quite. More the expression of a man who recognizes a precisely constructed argument and finds it adequate. I will assign escort this week. She picked up her pen. She opened the notation book. She wrote the date, the location, the objective, the documentation required. She wrote it in the same even hand she had used for 6 years of archive work. The hand that did not change under pressure or uncertainty, or the awareness that a man who ruled a territory was sitting across from her and had just agreed, with essentially no argument, to send her to another city to retrieve a story the record had lost. The winter gave them 6 weeks of work before the roads could be considered passable. It was the most sustained intellectual engagement Celine had experienced since Maret was alive. The king read what she read, and arrived at different interpretations sometimes, not from carelessness, but from a field man's knowledge of terrain she could not access from documents alone, and when she asked him about it, he explained precisely enough that the explanations became useful to carry forward. She asked about Torvik Pass on the 14th day. The field reports were complete, the attribution to Veth Dairy sound, but the tactical logic of the ravine position had a gap she could not close from documents alone, a choice the field report recorded without explaining. He was quiet for a moment when she asked. Then he said, she knew the ravine. She had mapped it the previous summer. The position she chose was not in any tactical manual, because no one had been in that specific ravine to know what it looked like from the northern lip. Personal reconnaissance, Celine said. She went in alone, he said, before the engagement, spent a night in it, came out with the positioning marked in margins on a map the size of a handspan. Celine looked at the field report, the map with marginal notations that she had been staring at for 6 years, that she had attributed and documented and built 14 pages of case around. That was now an official document of the archive. A map the size of a handspan. Spent a night in a ravine alone. The gap in the field report, she said. The positioning logic. She didn't explain it because she assumed the map was self-evident. Yes, he said, to someone who had been in the ravine. To someone who had been in the ravine, she said. Which was her. She wrote a notation. It was a small one, a single line, appended to the document number for the ravine report. See marginal map, positioning derived from personal reconnaissance confirmed. She had not been able to write that notation for 6 years because she had not had the confirmation, and now she had it. The council's second inquiry arrived in the 5th week, submitted in writing to the archive rather than through a personal visit, which told her something about how the previous personal visit had been received. The inquiry was longer this time, formally worded, and contained a question she had not seen before. Whether the archive keeper had a personal relationship with the Alpha King that constituted a conflict of interest in the administration of official records. She read it twice. Then she set it aside, drafted a reply in terms that were precise and complete, and established with documentation that every correction request she had filed was individually substantiated and independently verifiable, that the methodology she employed was consistent with archival standards that had been in place since the founding compact, and that the question of conflict of interest in record administration was a matter governed by the charter of the archive, not by the council's discretion, and she would be happy to provide the charter chapter and verse. She had the charter. Of course she had the charter. She sent the reply. She filed a copy. She returned to the documentation for the Aleph inquiry and did not think about the word personal in the council's question more than was necessary to note that she had noticed it, and that it was the kind of word a person used when they had run out of specific grounds and wanted to see if a more general insinuation would open a door. The roads opened on the first warm week of early spring. The king sent escort, 4 of his shadow guard, good riders, quiet men who traveled without requiring conversation. She packed the documentation in a waterproofed satchel and wore her second cloak, and rode out from the keep at dawn on a morning when the frost had finally gone from the ground, and the sky was a pale, clear blue, and the fields outside the wall smelled of cold earth, beginning to consider the idea of thaw. The king rode with them to the first boundary marker. He had not said he was going to do this. He simply was there at the gate when the escort assembled, mounted, and he rode the first hour at the front and said nothing about it. And the escort said nothing, and Salen rode beside him and also said nothing. And when they reached the boundary marker, he pulled his horse to a stop, and she pulled hers to a stop beside him, and the escort went ahead a distance and waited. He looked at the road south. She looked at the road south. The morning was cold and clear. "The council will have someone in Aleph before you," he said. "Yes," she said. "She may not want to speak to an official inquiry." "I am not an official inquiry," she said. "I am a keeper with documentation, asking if the documentation is accurate." He looked at her. The look was the one she was beginning to know well enough to wait for the clause that came after it. "Come back," he said. It was short, flat, carrying more weight than 2 words had any right to carry, and she understood from the weight of it that this was not an administrative instruction. She looked at him for a moment with the same precision she had brought to 6 years of silent case building, to 14 pages of methodology, to a correction request that most people would not have had the patience to make correctly. She had built those things not because she lacked fear, but because she had learned to work in the presence of uncertainty without letting it revise what she knew was true. "I will come back," she said, with the documentation authenticated. He held her gaze for one more count, and then he turned his horse and rode back toward the keep without looking back, because he was a man who did not perform a steadiness he lacked, and what she saw in the set of his shoulders was not performance. She turned south. The woman in Aleph was named Dara Fennick, 61 years old, gray in her hair, the build of someone who had spent a physical life without apology. She received Selim in an office with maps on every wall and looked at the documentation spread on her table with the expression of a person who had been carefully not thinking about something for a very long time. She did not speak for several minutes. Then she said, "He sent you." "He found the discrepancy in the record," Selim said. "I documented it. The correction has already been entered for Torvek Pass and Dune and the Ash Walls. I am here because the Grey Ford engagement has a similar discrepancy." Dara Fennick looked at the battle map. The same positions, the flanking element through the marshland, the drawn-out feint. Her gaze moved across it with the ease of someone reading her own handwriting. "I was told," she said, "when they removed me from the field, that my assessments were not strategically relevant." "Your assessments won 3 engagements," Selim said. "The documentation supports it fully." The older woman looked up from the map. "The council's man arrived yesterday," she said. "He told me that any statement I gave would be treated as a private submission and held in administrative review." "The council does not administer the archive," Selim said. "The king does. The correction protocol that produced the Veth Dairy entries was approved by him directly." Dara Fennick was quiet. Then she said, "Veth Dari," quietly, as if the name were a small old object she had kept somewhere and not picked up in a long time. "She will have a marker in the field of honor this spring," Selim said. Her name is in the corrected record at all 5 border keeps and the library at Helvast. The silence after that was long. It was not a difficult silence. It was the silence of something resolving. Dara Fenwick signed the authentication statement and the corroborating declaration and the chain of provenance confirmation, her hand steady. When she finished, she said, "Tell him I said the gray Ford fog was a gift. I knew it was going to come in that morning. I had watched the weather pattern for a week." "I will put it in the record," Seelan said. She left Elith 2 days later, documentation signed, the council's representative not having found a door to open. She rode north through the spring mud and arrived at the keep on the 6th day. The king was in the archive when she arrived. He was reading, which was not surprising. She set the documentation on the desk. He looked at it. Then he looked at her, taking in the mud on her cloak and the steady expression she had worn for the journey and was still wearing. "Well," he said. "Authenticated," she said. "Signed. Dara Fenwick sends a message. The gray Ford fog was a gift. She watched the weather pattern for a week." He was still for a moment, and then he said, very quietly, "Good." It was not about the documentation. She hung her cloak. She sat down at her desk. She opened the notation book to the page where the gray Ford annotation waited, and she wrote the new entry beneath it in the same even hand. Corroborated by original architect Dara Fenwick, personal statement dated. She wrote the date. She wrote the location of the authenticated documents. Outside the high window, the spring had finally arrived. The frost was gone. The fields were green with early growth, and the air smelled of running water and thawed earth. Seelan closed the notation book. The record was as complete as she had been able to make it for now. There would be other gaps. There always were. She intended to find them. The king was still in the archive when she looked up. He was watching her with the expression she had given up trying to catalog, and had started instead to simply know, the way she knew the sound of a correctly authenticated seal by long repeated exposure to what was genuine. She placed the annotation slip for Greyford into the binder. She placed the binder on the shelf where it belonged, spine out, correctly labeled. She did not look at him, because she had spent 6 years in this room learning to work in the presence of things that she could not fully see yet and would have to wait for, and she knew how to wait. The annotation slip read, "Recorded in full, record corrected, originals held." She had written it in her clearest hand. It was the cleanest document she had ever produced.